Und so the little girl, well warned against the wolf and snug in her bright red cloak, skipped along the woods to see her grandmother. Guillaume Barthélemy wiped his balding pate in consternation as he listened. The nursemaid's thick accent lilted now lightly over the words, yet her new fluency hardly registered in the face of the story's sense. What could Pernette be thinking, telling his daughter, his fevered Agnes, this now? Not a month back they had called him, the village doctor, to witness a babe savaged in its crib, soft limbs rent to gobbets. He had taken in the red-stained feathers of the ripped mattress. It drank in the scarlet fluid. He examined it for claw marks. It had to be wolves. No famine had yet landed, despite these long glacial months following an early winter. At least none he could compare back to the one long ago, that winter just before he left Dijon for Montpellier to study medicine, back when he had a full head of hair. The wild beasts had prowled even into the town streets. This winter larders were still stocked, but what else? What other ferocity could explain the tiny organs strewn across the sheets? His certainty grew with every sign, up until he saw upon the infant's chubby neck the traces of a strangling hand. A rampage followed, attack upon attack. Those who had seen the creature described it loping, then walking upright into the snowbanks, into the forest closing over it. It lay its whole length in the snow, began Father Saulnier, but he was in his cups again, communion wine stinking on his breath. But Legros, the thatcher, disgust etched into his mouth, corroborated. It crawled along, belly to the ground, face against the earth. Farmer Trouer joined in, hardly trusting his own eyes, then slunk off into the trees before rising on two hind legs. He shook less from the harsh winds than from fear. And handprints, too, said Nicolas Huet, the poultryman and Barthélemy's nearest neighbor. The sturdy young husband wrapped his arms around his swollen-bellied Marguerite. Her time would soon be upon her. At the thought, the doctor saw again the traces of fingers on the first victim's wobbling neck. He drew closer to the others. Together they eyed the horizon, rising with the mountain's silhouette, the depth of evergreen branches overladen with clumps of white. Something hideous, the malbête, the versipellis, took refuge behind those trees. The inevitable name came to their lips, whispered at first, then grumbled, then cried out, "Idiot Jean!" The boy had no family name. His father, or guardian at least, no one knew, had been a hermit that died of the last famine in his mountain hut. Furred predators had feasted on his body. Since that time the simple-minded orphan wandered the church graveyard, screeching by moonlight and moondark. The doctor found him there once, as he went to visit his Anne. His Anne, his wife, had lain in the cemetery, blue eyes forever shut, since a fortnight and 3 days after little Agnès' birth. Dawn had hardly broken when he came upon her tombstone. The boy, idiot Jean, slept hard by, his wide mouth dribbling. Did the youngster sense Anne's nurture from beyond the grave? The doctor put a gentle hand on the slim, muscled shoulder. Jean. Barthélemy jumped at the howling that followed. Gathering himself, he took the hardy, slight body in his arms, as Anne might once have done. The baying slowly diminished into a small yelp. Young as he was, the lad clearly suffered from exacerbated melancholy. He inherited it, perhaps, from his putative father. Black bile could flood the humoral balance, inducing a craving for solitude, a need to flee human company. Left untreated, it led to a specific kind of madness, of malady. Barthélemy recalled the images of his medical books, tracking the mutation, the frightful change of face, of head, of form, from man to beast. He remembered the other symptoms: hirsute growth, dry breath, scabbed legs. The doctor tried taking the boy back home with him, but he ran off into the wooded mountain heights. Yes, melancholy. Now that yowling came back to him. The depredations accumulated with snows, bitterer still than winter's teeth sinking in. Every few days the doctor examined a freshly sundered corpse, an abomination of bellies eaten out, thighs and arms, the rest left aside. The runoff from the victims melted the blinding drifts into pink slush. Alongside the animal butchery, marks of a hand haunted their livid skin. How? How then could this nursemaid, this Pernette as the villagers called her, merrily recite wolf stories while something hellish and frightful preyed upon their children? He could not be certain how much his unconscious daughter heard, but the doctor had to ask himself how the stories could affect the child's brain, imprinting on her mind like tracks on the ground, like bruises. Never robust, and yes, had always suffered her sicknesses patiently. Now, though, this humoral excess could so easily slip into the lethal. It took the girl just at her menarche, far too early for a child of barely 9 winters. At first she refused bouillon. Now bacon passed under her nose could not rouse her. All the fleshiness of childhood shrank into nothing. Her concave belly, with its scarlet freckled birthmark inherited from her mother, pierced him. So did the sight of her hips jutting through her shift. Barthélemy entered the dim room, intending to rebuke the nursemaid. Hardly thicker than the candle flame, Pernette bent over his daughter's mound of blankets. Rapt, the old woman breathed out in her low rumble of words, "Beautiful child." Traces of Anne's lovely features did still show through Agnès' hollowed cheek. Her gentian blue eyes once shone under the closed lids. The doctor in him, however, knew the child to be far from fetching in this emaciated state. Yet the devotion written in the nursemaid's spare body stopped short any attempt to correct her. She leaned over and inhaled at the crook of the little girl's neck. The doctor willed away his goose flesh, putting it down to her foreign ways. For, like himself, she came from elsewhere, hailing from well over and past the Jura, where they spoke their harsher tongue. Arriving unknown in the village, her name unpronounceable, her past a blank, she could not find work. The newly-wed Marguerite Huet feared for what might soon quicken in her belly, and refused to have the old woman in the house. She knew the elder's lazy, untrackable gaze, her rickety body and wrinkled face might imprint on any fertile womb. She warned other young wives. So Pernette begged her bread and slept with the kine. Barthélemy himself advised sternly against anything that might shock the eyes of mothers-to-be. He had even thus counselled his wife. Yet, late in her confinement, she came upon him at autumn slaughter. Huet and Trouer had come to him, town-bred doctor that he was, to help. The blood spattered Anne's dress. At the violence of the sheep turning to mutton before her eyes, her time came upon her, 8 months in. She collapsed. He brought her to their bed. The spray of mutton blood etched her flesh, staining it around her navel. As a medical man, this could not surprise him, so violent was the image's impact. For days together the contractions came and went, and with them her consciousness. When the child finally arrived, the selfsame marks showed on its rounded little belly. The tiny thing had trouble latching, but snuggled against its mother for warmth and life. Not that there was much life to glean. Anne fared poorly. "If you would but let me rid you of these unwholesome humours, you would soon mend." The proud, frightened father spoke softly, his wife's forehead under his hand. She drew her arms up, folded them, and drifted again into sleep. In a spell of wakefulness her eyes fell upon the spray of scarlet freckles on the child's belly. Horror broke over her face. "She is marred!" "Oh, no, it's only a birthmark, just like your own's recent appearance. See?" As she turned away, sinking back into her swoon, he ran his hand through his receding hairline, trying to think what might draw her back. Soon after, he prayed over her grave. The innocence of his daughter inspired the name of Agnès, for agneau or lamb. Yet, when it came to christening her, Barthélemy always found the priest too drunk to say mass. The doctor might have had to swear his Catholic faith to pursue his studies. In truth, though, he had never had use for such vagaries. He understood concrete things, the temperaments, the fluids, the hot, the dry, the cold, the wet, how seasons and stars affected them. Transubstantiation he left to Father Saulnier, the mystery of which drove him to drink. It didn't stop the priest from believing that the child's lack of baptism caused her frailty. Barthélemy was fully aware that Anne's initial collapse at the slaughter triggered what ever since was devouring their daughter. At this final blow of her first blood, Agnès vanished into a wordless limbo, a twilight like that which fell upon her mother before her death. Barthélemy could almost swear that the red freckles on her belly took on a deeper hue. Thus imprints worried the doctor. He had heard Marguerite Huet warn the other young wives. She told them true about the marks that a gestating babe might receive from the sight of the stranger Pernette. Barthélemy could only agree. Yet the elderly woman's queer gaze, her skin hanging in folds over her old bent bones, offended less than her speech. Halted, guttural, it marked her for an outsider. So she begged her bread from door to door, spending her nights in barns, with cow's breath to keep her from the cold. If she received the occasional copper piece, well, as often as not, it came from the doctor's pocket. Barthélemy would ask her to sweep up the hearth or to bring the milk or eggs from the Huet place around the bend. He had once asked her to cook for them. The resulting pandemonium told him that this skill was clearly beyond her ken. Yet he gave to her, for he had had time enough to consider how this village at the foot of the mountains treated those not their own. Barthélemy had himself moved here for Anne. Niece to one of his first patients back in Dijon, her tender touch on her aunt's departing form moved him. Soon he asked for her hand of her widowed uncle. After the joy of marriage he awaited that of fatherhood, waited longer, and longer yet. 5 years later, and still no child, he began to think the town noisome, especially living at the outskirts near the butchers, where the rank smell of their handiwork poisoned the air. Anne and Barthélemy moved some leagues away to a countryside village near the mountains, where he had heard of need for medical arts. In the purer air Anne soon got with child. He recalled that it was nearing Carnival when it finally happened for them. She fell pregnant just as they bid farewell to meet for Lent. He got on well enough as doctor. He even learned their patois as best he could. That is, until Anne's death. After that, this decade passed, or nearly so, as his hair disappeared and Agnès grew. The villagers shied away from him except in sickness. The Huets remained faithful, but even so could not or would not help at Agnès' most recent malady. Barthélemy sought and sought among the village for help as he could, for he did not manage alone. He received naught in turn but eyes that looked down and away at him and his plea. Their fear of whatever ate at Agnes ate instead at their hearts. He went about caring for his daughter as a doctor could at least, feeding her the diet of wet aliments prescribed by Galen for such dry diseases, when she would eat at least, and letting her blood. One night Agnes murmured, despite his razor's fine edge. He hated slicing into her lean little elbow, but forced himself for her own good. The blood spilling over into the bowl contained that corruption that fed upon her. Yet for all his work to drain this pernicious imbalance, she only grew weaker. He watched her small lungs rise and fall, shallow, over and over again, swelling and ebbing further. She gasped and seemed almost to say something, just as a knock fell on the door. Under the moonless sky, a silhouette against the starlight declared his visitor to be the same stranger, this woman, thin as the blade he had just wiped of Agnes's blood. At first he reached in his pocket. A coin might help her along. She shook her head. What then? Do you need help? Are you hurt? She shook her head again. Save her. Who is ill? Where must I go? Is it Marguerite Huet? No. Save her. I know. Save whom? Girl, I know. So she knew how to save Agnes, or claimed to. Barthélemy looked past the crow's feet of her eyes, past their split stare, and into their compelling hazel glow. He opened the door. Pernette, he called her as the villagers did, set great store by Agnes from the first hour. The new addition to the household tenderly nursed her from daybreak till deep in the night, even as the weeks passed. She soon referred to the little one as her child. He did not like it, perhaps her native land's expression. She exclaimed in the same glottal stops over her beauty, a child whose dark under eye dug nearly into her cheek, whose bones poked at her skin. The village was full, or had been, of hearty tots and growing striplings, their cheeks bright. One would think any of them more appealing than the withering Agnes. But dote Pernette did, perhaps from gratitude at finding a home. You must dine with me, Pernette, he asked, at first. She shook her head. We have roast this evening, pork belly, and carrots from the cellar. Clearly, she preferred to take her meals elsewhere, wherever that might be. When she left the house, he sighed his relief, for when she did speak, she prated of damnation. She spit out its description as if personally acquainted, her left eye fiercely engaging him, her right pale and wandering. He grew to suspect her for a Calvinist. This did not concern him, as his yet unchristened daughter attested. If she were a secret Protestant, even Anabaptist, it did not signify. Only her devotion to Agnes mattered. When a blizzard blew in, he insisted, Pernette, you cannot go abroad in this. This evening, at least, you must share my table. She hesitated, then nodded. As the flakes whirled at the rimed window, he prepared himself for the tiresome gabble of imps and perdition. In hell, she began. He let her harp on the hereafter, turned a deaf ear to the garble escaping a mouth running with fat. She gnawed the mutton shank, grinding at the naked bone. The poor thing had surely suffered dire hunger. He looked away. In hell, Tance! His attention reawakened when he began to better understand her words. As she described devils cavorting in the flames, he could almost hope for such braziers to thaw his muscles into joining them. He winced as she belched her meal's end and retired to nurse Agnes. As she walked into the bedroom, he noticed a change in the old woman's silhouette. A new flesh rounded out the gaunt angles of her shoulders. She looked back, her left eye hovering at a spot over his shoulder. He turned, half expecting to see Anne standing behind him. to say what he wished he knew. He poured himself another glass of apple eau de vie, hot on his tongue, reminiscent of a world where flowers grew and fruit. Such tastes lay nearly forgotten in this eternity of icicle and hoarfrost. The snow might in the end rise to block the door. Then what? Perhaps it would deliver them. Perhaps it would leave the beast to freeze in the death of its grip. Yet he would still be trapped with this strange house guest and an ailing daughter. He sipped again at the spirits and listened to Pernette through the half-closed door. "The wolf followed the little girl." How fluently she spoke the words. She who could but grumble her throaty half-phrases. But this story, right now? It could not bode any good for his little girl. Barthélemy entered the room to interrupt. He found Pernette hovering over Agnès, rubbing the girl's neck and nape and lobes. She reached her wizened hand into a leather pouch, coating the little girl with its contents. Barthélemy grabbed it from her. "What on earth is that?" "Recipe. Family. Potent." That rasping, gruff reply was the first he'd heard of a family. He took the stuff and inhaled tentatively. The scent recalled the anatomy theater of his student days. Breathing it in more deeply, he coughed, heaving. The noxious odor promised well. He dared not bleed Agnès any further when she would take no nourishment. Perhaps this would shock her senses out of this deathward spiral. "Did you ever have children, Pernette?" "Legion," she replied. Did she mean the mercenaries that her land was known for? Had a son gone for a soldier, or had some lanzknecht fathered her a child? He declined to pursue that avenue as it bore no weight. Her attentions to Agnès proved her maternal capacities. He leaned over and laid a gentle kiss on his daughter's brow, burning his lips. That heat numbered her days. At that, the tale and his objections to it slipped entirely from his mind. Returning to the fireside and the eau de vie, he heard Pernette pick up the thread of the flowing narrative. "She gathered bouquets and went off into the copses to find more wild flowers. Their gay colors would bring her grandmother back to health." Harmless, after all. He let it go. Barthélemy went to the church. Father Saulnier ushered in the judge, come all the way from Besançon. "You are the barber?" "I am the physician." "A doctor." In the notable's mouth the title was hardly better. Before Barthélemy could reply, the authorities dragged in young Jean. He examined the boy. How he'd changed since the day the doctor found him at Anne's grave. The strained muscles of his throat hearkened to a beast's jaws, his long nose grown snoutish. Early stages of melancholy had worsened into this. Perhaps purges and restorative baths might help him now. That, and a letting so drastic as to leave him unconscious, a last effort at saving him. When black bile overwhelmed the blood to this extent, little else offered hope. Could a child's frame withstand it, though? For child he still was, despite the manly hair covering his body. Jean's slaver did not help his case, although typically lycanthropes had dry mouths. The judge peered down at the boy. In the following silence, Barthélemy wondered if the man intended to speak at all, or simply gaze at the prisoner. Jean squirmed, shifting on the stool until the judge addressed him. "Are you or are you not a Versipellis?" he intoned, in Latin. The boy looked up at the two men blankly, from face to face, his head a pendulum. The words meant nothing to him. Even proper French would have been beyond his abilities. The doctor, in his pity, translated to the patois. A turnskin. Jean yelped in reply. He did not understand. In other words, are you a werewolf? The judge returned to the attack. Did you or did you not, in the night of Saturday last, tear into and consume the living flesh of Denise Truer, 13 years old, of the Truer farm, as she herded her family's sheep, despite her brave attempt to thwart your attack with her knife? Pernette, luckily, had been passing nearby, coming from one of her mysterious meals, and discovered him. He had bitten her, she said, as she tried to pry him away. She had showed her bleeding hand to the doctor. Barthélemy dressed it with a honey poultice and lint bandage. He examined Jean's pale, slight, but sinewy body. The scabby thighs showed a malformed coloring, more telltale signs. At his pinprick the boy bayed. Sometimes, however, even so, lycanthropes could still feel sensation in the devil's brand. Father Saulnier took over. Coat hung up and brushed of snow, boots drying, Barthélemy settled by the hearth, poking the logs into life. Jean had not seemed to possess the strength of mind to be afraid. His wide-eyed wonder stayed with the doctor, along with his witless whine of denial, lost in the accusations. Barthélemy shook his head loose of the echo. He turned his attention to the apple spirits. A second glass followed the first, and a third to follow the second, burning its way down his throat and into his cold veins, into his frozen marrow. From the bedroom again, Pernette drove home her words. The wolf asked the little girl. Something frantic in her tone did not agree with the tale told to soothe the child into healing sleep. He meant to tell her, again, to refrain from this story. But a log falling off set off a spark. It boded ill for Jean. Pernette prattled. He did not listen. Barthélemy's ears were full still of the boy's screams as they put him to the question for his monstrous crimes. They had had to carry the small, broken body to the stool. They had had to lift his limp hand to place a shaken and blurred X below the document. The doctor read it through. Jean had confessed all. He told of the dark man in the forest and his pitch-black mount, of the wolf cloak and the fur belt. He told of the ointment that made him run with the pack in the mountains and hunger for little ones, for their meat tender under his tooth, fattier and juicier than that of the grown. Could the questioning, however cruel, really have inspired such an abundance of evidence? The boy lacked the faculty to imagine such things. He could not have made up these horrors. He could, in fact, barely speak. His illness was punishment enough, poor melancholic sod, the black bile engulfing him into beasthood. Barthélemy had watched, regretful, as they prepared the kindling, the rope to bind him to the stake, a small one. A fortnight later the doctor could not relight the hearth. The very embers revolted him. Barthélemy murmured, aloud even, a prayer. May the boy's suffering serve as purgation for any sin. It was a malady that afflicted him into committing such loathsome acts. And he must have committed them. First there was the confession, then the fact that Pernette had seen him with her own eyes feasting on the little shepherdess before the frail elder bravely chased him off. The flames had licked at the screaming youngster, growing higher than he stood. May the fire devour you as you devoured your victims, Father Saulnier had cried over the screeching. Thatcher Legros and Huet the poultryman held up Farmer Truer, father of the mauled girl. The whole village stood witness. The whole village, that is, but for the nursemaid. Pernette had stayed home to watch over Agnès. Happily, she missed the reek of the boy's viscera crisping and melting under his roasting hide. She did not see, as Barthélemy had, the snow turned water, then steam, Beneath lay the hard, black, sterile ground waiting to swallow the werewolf's remains. How to cleanse that stench from his nose? Every time the doctor closed his eyes, the after-image of a writhing silhouette against that fire, the evildoer's dark shape, imprinted itself onto his inner gaze. One thing might bring comfort. He threw back the eau de vie again and went to find Agnès. In the twilight room he had had to move Pernette away, push her even, if he were to hold his daughter. He embraced a trembling sack of skin. Only that sickly hot shivering induced him to return to the hearth and set the chimney to smoking again. He turned his eyes away from its furnace to stare instead into the snow, its shadowy blue strangling the hardened ground beyond. In his reverie he caught Pernette halfway, the words in the other room. The wolf swallowed the grandmother whole, and the little girl looked on. He thought he heard her say, smiling. But before he could look in to be sure, a pounding at the door summoned him. Nicolas Huet leaned his burly body, his arm astrut against the door frame, heaving breath that hung as frozen mist in the air. Marguerite was all he could muster. By midnight, the young woman brought her newborn to her breast. Seeing fresh life and a mother's love heartened Barthélemy, even as it cut him to his quick. He trudged homeward, still smelling the milk along with the blood and the excrement. Visions of an infant cuddling its mother warmed him and tormented him, leaving tracks on his mind as his boots in the snowdrifts on the way home. He knocked them loose of their icy clumps against the dying hearth, knocking the image from his head at the same time. As he moved to sit, he overheard her again. The Malbête invited the girl to the bed and opened his mouth to... He entered the low-lit room, the candle burning. Pernette was coating Agnès with that vile-smelling salve, and its whiff of dissection. The nursemaid's well-padded knuckles above the bandaged wound rubbed the ointment into Agnès's flesh, her hands, her nape, her forehead. Pernette turned to him a glance that in the dimness he could read no further. Her eyes might have been looking at him as much as over his shoulder to some wraith unseen, surely Anne again. The nursemaid looked downward at the merest traces of ointment on her plump fingers. She pointed, must have more, then nodding at his daughter, soon need feed. That poor fever-dwindled body, if only the girl were ever hungry. With nothing precise to reproach Pernette, Barthélemy returned to his apple spirits. Behind his chair the door shut. He had turned in time to see the nursemaid throw her worn old cloak over her shoulders, surely but little protection against the cold. Moreover, what symbols could she possibly cull in this snow? He nodded off in front of a fire that held but little solace. By the time he retired to his bed, he had not heard the door reopen. In his dreams, he was at the Truer farm rendering fat for soap. A woman's scream shattered the icy dawn. He knew the scream, had listened to it for hours, all through the afternoon and night. He jumped into the bitter half-morning, threw on his boots, slipped into his cloak, not even bothering to take off his nightcap or change out of his nightgown. Marguerite Huet's newborn, or what was left of it, lay in the bed, belly and thigh mangled. At the sight of it, Barthélemy ran from the house to retch. The parts gone confirmed Jean's confessed taste for the fattiest, juiciest morsels of human flesh, what babies could offer. But Jean was now puddle and ash. He cursed he knew not what or whom, and returned to the cottage. A keening Marguerite tore out her own hair by handfuls. He promised to return with something by which to forget, for a passing moment at least, what had befallen her babe. His vomiting, even after his stomach emptied, halted his walk home. By the time he opened his own door, Pernette looked up from grinding something, her hands scabbed over. "Is you a wife?" she asked, her face like stone. Defeated, he told her of the mincemeat of the infant's guts. Her eye unfathomable in its leer, she licked her lips and ground up a fresh batch of the foul ointment. With none other to tell, Barthélemy swore of the sacrifice of the young dullard, horrific and futile. He cursed the role he'd played. Without a word, Pernette scooped the ointment into her pouch with her once knobby fingers. "This set her good," she said, nodding toward the girl's room. He stared back at her as she left the kitchen. His legs numb, he put his stockinged feet before the burning hearth. Where a melting Jean shrieked at him. Barthélemy swallowed his apple spirits into his empty belly over and again until his head spun. Then he heard her again. Had drink turned his mind? The girl jumped into the bed, cuddled the Malbête, running her little fingers through his hair. The doctor ran into the room to ask what she meant by repeating such things to his daughter. A fitful Agnès turned, murmured, her stomach miraculously growling. The room stood otherwise empty. No Pernette leaned over her. Only her cast-off cloak lay on the floor. He opened the armoire, looked behind the curtains under the beds, hers and his own, all to no avail. He even rounded out the back door, then raced to the front. Yet worried more than ever for Agnès, he abandoned the search and returned to the bedroom. He took up the cloak, expecting a flimsy single-layer wool. Any lining would have surprised him, even squirrel or rabbit. With no possible doubt, however, this pelt had once been a wolf. He grabbed his daughter's hands, cool now to the touch. He pulled her to him, her body slick with salve, no longer trembling. From behind her ears, her nape, sprouted something rough and gray. She opened her lids, the orbs beneath them a pale yellow glow.
The School of Fiction